Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. The last 18 months have been challenging for the ag industry, and we've seen a roller coaster of milk prices throughout the COVID pandemic. As the world begins to normalize, we can now shift our focus to impacting efficiency and profitability across the dairy operation. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell, one of your hosts at the Real Science Exchange, and tonight we're going to get really practical and dig into ways we can improve milk component production. Our first guest is Dr. Tom Overton from Cornell University. Tom, you've been a part of the Real Science Lecture Series in the past and presented some research on maximizing milk protein, and I believe that was back in June of 2020. But this is your first time here at the Exchange, so welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
You're very welcome. And if you wouldn't mind, could you, one, tell us what you're drinking tonight, and then two, kind of give us a quick overview of what the listeners can expect to hear tonight.
Yeah, so I've got a gin and tonic here in a thermal mug with one of my favorite sayings from Winston Churchill about never giving up. And I think that's a good motto for us, not only in coming out of a pandemic, and what we've done last year, plus, but also in the dairy industry as we ride that, seems like ever going roller coaster.
Yep, absolutely. And so, give us kind of a little bit of a background in terms of what we can expect to hear tonight.
So we're going to talk about milk components, and it's an area that has gotten a lot of attention, of course, over many years now. In the U.S. anyway, we've been component priced for more than 20 years, I think, at this point in time. But I think it's an area where we've really made some gains and continue to make some gains. And so we're going to talk about some of the trends over time. Corwin Holtz, who's my guest tonight, will talk about some of the science and application relative to the factors that affect components at the farm level. We'll talk about decision making. Of course, in the last year, some of these base programs that co-ops have put into place have thrown a new wrinkle in there. And then we'll talk about some of the newer fatty acid or milk fat or milk composition testing that's now available or becoming more prevalent across the country.
Very well. Tom, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you remember when we first met? Probably not. I know, that's embarrassing.
Well, I know we talked about Mike Van Amberg. I'm sure we talked about Mike Van Amberg the first time we met, given your collegiate affiliation with each other.
Yeah. Well, we can tell stories about him. But the first time we met, I'd been hearing about this Tom Overton guy. I'd never met you. And it was back at the ADSA that was held in Indianapolis. And you know how they have activities before the ADSA, sometimes a run. This happened to be an organized softball game. And
I do remember this now.
Yep. I don't remember when that was. Clay, you probably remember what year that was, but
it was in the late 90s.
Yeah, late 90s. And I show up and we just kind of, split up on teams. And I was batting behind you. I hadn't yet met you yet. And first time through the batting order, you smack one over the fence. Home run, round tripper. And then after I got done with my at-bat, I went over and introduced myself. And lo and behold, it was the fabled Tom Overton. So anyway, that's
not quite. I think it may be the one and only round tripper of my life. How's that? So we'll leave it at that.
It might have been a Little League field. I'm not sure, but
might have been.
Tom, you've already introduced your guest, and so Corwin, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And we're very interested to hear your on-farm perspective on this. First, tell us what's in your glass, and do you have any stories you can tell from working with Tom?
Well, both my wife and I, Debbie, we are red wine drinkers. So good glass of Merlot or a red blend or a Malbec. And tonight I have a Merlot from Duckhorn Wineries out in the Napa Valley.
Nice.
And actually, that's where my roots are, is out in the Napa, Sonoma area from many years past. Been a New Yorker since 1983, but grew up in the wine country.
Excellent. And my co-host, Dr. Clay Zimmerman, as always, is here at the pub again tonight. Clay, how's the hard cider tonight? Bubbly?
It's good. It is.
Watermelon again?
Okay, watermelon.
Good.
I'm in another rut.
Same rut. Well, since we're in the mood for sharing stories, do you have any Tom Overton stories?
I do. Actually, Tom and I share a passion. We are both Boston Red Sox fans. So at one point in his life, I think Tom lived near the Friendly's ice cream plant in Massachusetts. So yeah, we're both fans of the Boston Red Sox.
Good deal. Good deal. Well, tell you what, why don't we just dive right into the topics tonight? Tom, how has the focus on milk components changed over the last few years?
Well, I remember back when one of the things that's changed is I think people are much more thinking about pounds of fat and protein shipped per cow per day and things like that, rather than, or as an advancement on, rather than thinking just about milk yield and milk components. And that's been a bit of a shift, because I remember when I started a long time ago now, people would use high milk production as almost an excuse for poor components, right? They'd say, well, I've got 3-4 butter fat and 2-8, protein, but boy, I'm making 90 pounds of milk, and that just doesn't get the job done anymore. And Corwin, I'm not sure what you see out there, whether you're seeing more of that. I think it's still a work in progress in terms of how people think about components.
Yeah, it's still a discussion we continue to have with producers. They look at what comes from the milk plant in terms of percent fat and percent protein. That's kind of what's on their mind all the time, and we always have to keep reminding them that it's really the pounds of fat and pounds of protein that are being shipped that are actually paying the bills, and thus it just becomes that combination of yield and percents. And so we're trying to maximize both in most cases. But again, historically, it's been that the producer focus has tended to be on the percent side of the equation, and continual discussions on what's that fat pound yield and protein pound yield.
So, Corwin, I was wondering how do you look at that metric with your producers? Do you look at pounds of fat and protein? Do you look at energy corrected milk? How do you view that with your?
So what I'm monitoring on a monthly basis on my client herds is exactly those three things: energy corrected milk, pounds of fat, pounds of protein, and then also looking at a couple of ratios relative to dry matter intakes, looking at what our energy corrected feed efficiency is, and also our what I call component efficiency, pounds of fat and pounds of protein combined relative to herd average dry matter intake. So those are the parameters that we're tracking on a monthly basis.
Yeah, and actually in some of our work, those two general areas, right, account for about 75% of the herd variation in things like income over feed costs, which really is certainly related to profitability, but also heavily related to cash flow. So it makes sense to kind of key in on some things like that, I think.
What are the key factors affecting milk fat and milk protein production?
Well, there's a bunch of them, and I think that's what makes it kind of interesting. There's a whole bunch of nutritional factors that affect, especially milk fat, and we can get into that. We'll get into that in a little more detail here. But there's plenty of non-nutritional things: genetics, seasonality, heat stress, other types of things, or other management things at the farm level in terms of how cows are grouped or managed that may affect feeding behavior, which then in turn can affect what goes on in the rumen and affect components. So we'll dive into more of these, Scott, over the course of the pubcast here. So I want to circle back though just a little bit and talk about it. Maybe Corwin, you can chime in how some of your herds are doing or what you see out there. But we've been as Pro Dairy, we've been kind of pushing this fat and protein yield per cow per day for quite a few years now through things like Dairy Profit Monitor and things like that. When we started, we tell people that, you get to 5.5 pounds of fat and protein per cow per day. Yeah, you're doing okay. And then people began to kind of start doing that. So when people start doing that, we raise the bar, right? So, because that's what we do. And so then it became 6 pounds of fat and protein shipped per cow per day. Then, the top herds are pushing 7 pounds of components or more per head per day, and you don't. And again, like we started out here in this podcast, you've got to do that with a combination of high milk yield and good components to go along with it. You can't get there if you don't have both of those pieces. And former student of mine, actually, he's a Wisconsin native, large dairy out there. His herd was making, when he was in my nutrition class, he was making 115 pounds of milk with about a 4.1 fat and about a 3.2 protein. And I told him, I said, don't let anything I teach you mess up what you guys are doing out there, because that's pretty impressive. It was 8.7 pounds of components per cow per day. It was pretty amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Tom. I think go back a few years ago when we really started talking about this component yield, both from a producer standpoint, a lender standpoint. It's a number that the bankers, financial people are very much aware of and catching on to and looking at as they work with their clients. I think when we really got into this, it was kind of that 6 pounds of fat and protein. And the herds I'm working with now, our minimum goal is 6.5 and headed towards 7. That's kind of where those upper end herds are definitely shooting for. And then from a feed efficiency standpoint, trying to have a minimum of a 1.7 energy corrected milk feed efficiency across the herd. And then a minimum of what I call 11, somewhere between 11 and 12 component efficiency. That'd be pounds of fat and protein divided by the herd average dry matter intake. So those are some of the parameters that we have as goals with the client farms that I'm dealing with these days.
Yeah, so let's go down the road, Scott, that you were starting us down about some of the factors that affect, milk fat or milk fat and milk protein. And, when you look at the nutritional factors there that affect milk fat, a lot of that work was done by people like Dale Bauman and his group, continue to be done by people like Kevin Harvatine and Adam Locke and others. So really good scientists out there. And, we've learned a lot about, things that drive butter fat down and relates back to how fatty acids are consumed by the cow or metabolized in the rumen. So we get some altered rumen metabolism of unsaturated fatty acids, especially linoleic acid, which is the predominant fatty acid found in corn products, oil seeds. And so, we know if we get too much unsaturated fat, we know if we get low rumen pH, so tending toward acidosis, we know if we get mycotoxin issues, I think wild yeast issues. So there are definitely forage factors that come into play. We've learned that we are more at risk for low milk fat. So, and we've also learned that if we can change the diet or change some of those factors, we can recover that milk fat in about that, say, milk fat depression, right? So I'll just say 3.4, 3.3 in a Holstein. We can recover that within 10 to 14 days typically. And it's really kind of been interesting. It's like clockwork. And Corwin, you probably haven't had to rescue too many milk fats lately, but back a number of years ago when we were learning about all this stuff, it was kind of handy to have an understanding of this biology to then kind of guide us a bit in terms of troubleshooting.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, from a field standpoint that has really come to the forefront, and it goes back many years, but I think, my focus, and I think a lot of nutritionists' focus anymore is fiber digestibility in these diets and having high fiber digestibility. We feed, I tend to feed heavy corn silage diets, 70 to 80% of the forage dry matter base being corn silage dry matter, and then the other 20 or so percent being either grass haylage or alfalfa silage. And fiber digestibility from a rumen health standpoint, and just having acetate production and everything coming from that side of the nutrition equation just makes a huge difference. And a focus always every year is timely harvest on haylages and getting highly digestible corn silage put in the fall to get the right forage mix. And then we can run these diets at 60+% forage and get the kind of fiber digestibility that really drives a rumen and helps maximize microbial protein production, which is huge on the particularly the milk protein side of the equation.
Yeah, it was interesting. Kevin Harvatine, again, I mentioned Kevin, he's at Penn State, did a really interesting study a few years ago where he actually infused acetate into the rumen of cows and took milk fat, and these were within ranges that would be possible, I think, with highly digestible fibers. You mentioned, took these cows from a 3.9 to about a 4.2%, butter fat at the same milk yields. So of course, fat yields went at the same time. So I think, the cases of highly digestible fiber, makes sense here, right? Because you can drive some of that. Now, that's not going to necessarily rescue a low milk fat. You got other stuff going on there, but in terms of getting a little bit more, I think that makes sense, and that's a logical approach.
Talking about the importance of high quality forages, Corwin, do you get involved in actually consulting on growing the forages and the corn?
I will be the first to say that I'm not an agronomist. I make that very clear, but definitely trying to team up with the agronomists working on client farms, looking what our land base will best support, and then on variety selection, trying to look at varietal choices that'll yield both harvest yield along with high fiber digestibility. And starch has still got to come along with that as far as the corn silage side of the equation. Where I probably get involved in from a day-to-day standpoint, though, is just consistently having the conversation with clients about timely harvest and getting forages put up at the right kind of dry matters, getting bunks put in properly, proper packing, all the things that go into good silage making, so that we end up with forages that deliver the kind of feed that we as nutritionists can best work with.
So one of the things too, we'll stay on milk fat here before we kind of shift gears to milk protein. We tend to forget that, or at least I as a nutritionist, right, that indeed components are heritable, right? And Corwin, I know you've spent some time thinking about genetics, or maybe some of your herds think about genetics and how they also use those strategies to try to improve component yields, not just milk yield, but also component yields over time.
No question about it. When we look at across our client base, those herds that year round, we're going to have seasonal differences. We're going to have seasonal rhythms in both butter fat percent and protein percent. But year round, the herds that will tend to be at the higher end of both of those protein percent and butter fat percent, they have paid attention over the last 10 to 20 years on both percent and yield of butter, fat, and protein. That's been part of their genetic program. And I think it's an area that in some cases producers have maybe not paid quite as much attention to. And those herds will differentiate themselves, no question about it. The 3.8, 3.9 herd versus the 4.0, 4.1 Holstein herd. I'm a firm believer that a fair amount of that in many cases is a genetic potential difference between those herds.
Corwin, along those lines, have you seen any shift away to crossbreeding, bringing in some of the colored breed genetics?
We haven't seen it in our client base to a great degree. We have a couple of herds that have gone the Hojo route to a certain degree. Hasn't hit the Northeast like it has hit the Midwest. I don't have an answer for why that is. No question that we are seeing more Jersey cows in the dairy population here in the Northeast over the last few years. Some of that just lately has been driven a little bit by base programs and land-based issues also. Just how many cows can our land-based handle? And so we have seen some more Jersey activity here in the Northeast, but the crossbreed has not hit here quite as much as it has other parts of the country.
I want to go back to one factor, Corwin. You mentioned seasonality for a minute, and that's boy, the seasonality on components is highly conserved across year to year. I mean, obviously, it may vary a little bit in amplitude one year versus the next, but when I look at data and again some of the stuff Kevin's summarized and things like that, I mean, in the springtime, late winter, early spring, the components start to slide, and you can get, and that's before any meaningful heat stress whatsoever. So it's not really a heat stress deal, at least not initially anyway. But you can get a swing of 3 points of butterfat high to low, and then recover that in the fall and into the early winter. And it's got to be frustrating as a nutritionist, or at least I know I have a discussion with herds about, hey, just remember you're fighting Mother Nature here in the spring. You may be sliding in your component percentages, but you're fighting Mother Nature here to some extent.
Do most producers understand that?
They do, but they don't want to admit it.
They don't want to accept it.
They don't want to happily accept it, is maybe the way to put it. No, quite honestly, Tom, that's a discussion that's going on right now. The 3-2 proteins are down to the 3-1s, and the 4-1, 4-2 fats are down to the 3-9-5s and 4s and 4-1s. So we're beginning to see that seasonal change as we speak here this evening, and it's a conversation that continue to have with producers on a yearly basis. They don't like to hear excuses from their nutritionists, but hopefully we get the message across that it is Mother Nature and it is biology. I think one of the things on the butterfat side that has helped to a certain degree, we will, myself, I will vary my fat type of feeding as we come into the spring and summer months, getting more palmitic fatty acid into these cows, the palm oil type fats, to see if I can get some direct impact on butterfat and try to maintain that a little bit better as we go through these seasonal fluctuations.
Do your feeding recommendations vary depending on the economics of fat and protein to the producer?
They do. I think you start getting protein values down below $2.50 a pound of protein. I begin to question maybe some of my amino acid inclusion into diets. They're easy decisions for me to be chasing protein as you get into that $2.80, $3 protein values, to be looking hard at, do I have the amino acid profiles correct on the milk protein side of things. Butterfat, where butterfat isn't nearly worth as much, but I think in some cases, in a lot of cases with butterfat, that tends to be more overall nutrition based. Am I getting the right amount of fiber and digestible fiber into those cows? Do I have a healthy rumen? Are we dealing with slug feeding issues? I have a herd right now that we just made some changes in feeding management and all. And we've seen a response in milk fat due to some feeding management changes, getting more bunk space for cows in an overcrowded pen situation. And you look at some of the work up at Minor Institute over the last few years and other work that's been done relative to overcrowding and slug feeding. And that's certainly going to have a negative impact, particularly in my opinion, on the milk fat side of things. So I think there are management things, basic dietary things from a fiber and rumen health standpoint that I can chase after and don't have to spend a lot of money on the milk fat side, maybe quite as much as over on the milk protein side. But the heavier palm feeding though has been beneficial to help maintain some of that seasonal butterfat change that we see. And right now, all dry fats are expensive, so feeding a little more palm really hasn't seemed to make a huge economic difference in terms of the overall fat supplementation in these diets from a cost standpoint.
How much palm are you trying to get into them, Corwin? When it is cost effective?
It'd be up anywhere from half a pound to maybe as high as 3/4 of a pound in some herds. My experience with the heavy palms is just, my experience. I don't know what other nutritionists see. If I go too heavy on the palm at times, my experience has been it does what it's supposed to do. It goes and makes butterfat. And I have gotten myself in a little bit of trouble in a couple of situations over the years where I've almost gone too heavy on it and lost some body condition in the herd. So I've had to balance those two from time to time to make sure that I'm not overdoing it and not sacrificing some body condition and reproductive performance, et cetera.
You also mentioned that you're manipulating amino acids to chase the milk protein. Can you give us an idea of what kind of supplements you're using and what kind of levels are you looking at?
Well, trying to, I use the NDS program, so kind of following some of their basic guidelines, trying to use some both methionine sources, and when the program calls for it, a little bit of lysine supplementation also. Basically following some of the basic NDS guidelines, trying to get my methionine ratio to ME up around 1.08, 1.1 in the NDS program has seemed to work well for me. And then tending to be in that high 2.6, low 2.7 lysine to methionine type of ratio. So just, basic CNCPS NDS guidelines along those lines have worked pretty well. And then you let the cows tell you, and you manipulate things from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Corwin's using some of the newer work that Mike Van Amberg really is kind of responsible for, where he's kind of integrated in amino acid supply with energy. And I think that conceptually that's really attractive, because if you look at the first, 25 years of amino acid balancing for milk protein, it was just all about lysine, methionine, or percent of MP, maybe grams, what have you, and so that's kind of where the discussions began and ended with milk protein strategies. And yet we know that energy is really, protein synthesis is energy driven. You need to have the amino acids, but it makes sense to line it up with energy. And so it's been kind of interesting just to kind of play with this new approach out there a bit. And again, conceptually, as I said, it's quite attractive. So again, we always seek to kind of keep moving things ahead, right? So
I think we see more consistent responses in the field with that approach too.
It would make sense, right? It makes sense. And then, of course, it also goes back to where corn started out, right? It goes back to rumen fermentation, digestible fiber, digestible carbohydrate, carbohydrate digestibility, fermentability in the rumen, really driving, energy status, energy supply to the cow. So, and you put the amino acids with that, and, I think you are set up for a pretty decent response potentially.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one thing that NDS has really pointed out to me, and I know Mike Van Amberg is, as he talks about the CPS approach overall, whether it be NDS or AMTS or other programs, is really knowing what true dry matter intake is in these groups of cows. And that's something that I've really been tightening the screws down on, is really paying attention to where these herds are at on a pin by pin, TMR by TMR basis, as far as what true dry matter intakes are, to make sure that I get things dialed in as tightly as I possibly can, because huge differences in those programs between that group that's maybe at 64 pounds of intake versus the group that's at 60 pounds of intake. So that's been one thing that NDS has really shown me. I've got to really pay attention to make the numbers fit what the cows are telling me at the end of the day.
So what are some of your better dairymen doing to make sure that they're maximizing dry matter intake? You've heard horror stories of the nutritionist showing up and you got an empty bog and those kinds of things. What are some of the best practices they're employing?
Well, I don't know how any herd can manage, especially a herd of any kind of size, without some kind of a TMR tracking program on their mixer wagon, whether it be FeedWatch or Easy Feed or TMR Tracker or Feed Supervisor, whatever it might be. Is there good data that I as a nutritionist have to work with, and that their feed crew has to work with? So that's first and foremost in my book. As far as monitoring things, I am in the process of getting more and more cameras put in looking over feed bunks, so we can look at them 24 hours a day and make sure that feed's getting pushed up, that we're not shorting cows on feed, that we're not having excess refusals. I mean, there's both sides of the equation. And I think one of the things that I know we talk about in our group quite a bit is I think we've got to be careful that we don't exceed what dry matter intakes really should be. I know at times, I'll visit with some people and they'll brag about their 68-pound intakes, and their cows are making the same milk as a herd that's, got high cows at 62 pounds of intake. I think we can really go overboard in some cases, and got to watch that we're, every pound of dry matter these days is not cheap with the current feed costs we have. So again, coming back to that energy corrected milk relative to feed efficiency is a number that doesn't, in some ways it doesn't directly pay the bills, but it gives you an idea of what the biology of that nutrition is accomplishing on a day-to-day basis. But no, the cameras are, I'm getting bigger and bigger on those to make sure that we've got a 24-hour eye on what's happening at the feed bunk.
Mm-hmm.
So no, that's a good point, Corwin. From an efficiency standpoint, we could go too far the other way with high intake. So what are some things we can do to maybe improve our milk production efficiency?
To improve the milk production efficiency?
Yep. Yeah, you talked about that as a metric earlier, right? Your energy corrected feed efficiency.
Yep. Well, I think one of the things that I constantly have a conversation with my clients is our herd too young? I think that's one area that I can't speak to other parts of the country, but here in the Northeast, 2.1, 2.2 lactations is about the herd average as we go across the Northeast. It's way too young in my opinion. We should be up in the 2.4 to 2.6 average lactation. And that's a constant conversation I have with clients. Now, in an expanding herd, yes, you're going to have a younger herd because you're constantly growing the herd, bringing in, 2-year-olds to grow the herd and all. But in herds that are mature and they are maxed out on cow numbers, to be running 2.1, 2.2 lactations to me is unacceptable. We need to be keeping cows around longer and maximizing lactations per cow as best we can. So that's an area that I think has a lot of opportunity in a lot of herds, because those older cows, we know they make more milk, plain and simple, and they're more efficient. They're not growing. Their feed efficiency, because of not eating it up in growth activity as a younger cow would, just a lot of positives there. So that's an area that I focus in a lot with my herds that are in that static herd size situation these days. Yeah.
But really influences too how many heifers you got to have, right? The heifer
Absolutely.
inventory at the herd level. I mean, that's a it seems like it wasn't that long ago where you'd almost see maybe not that many fewer heifers than cows on a dairy, and definitely we're seeing that number come down as people think about that. I don't know if you have a sweet spot for where you'd like to be, heifers to cows and things like that, but
depending on cull rates in the herd and how they do with 60-day cull rates and things like that, I think a heifer inventory anywhere between 65 and 75% of total cow numbers is a very real number to be, or area to be working in. And for a long time, we've had herds at 90 to 110% of heifers to cows. And man, it's a lot of money sitting out there in a heifer inventory. And the problem we've had is that when these herds become static and they have those kind of heifer numbers, who gets pushed out? You got a fresh heifer, and it's the older cows that get pushed out, unless they've really got a market to sell springing heifers, which doesn't tend to be the case in most cases. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in herd age and average lactation number.
so Corwin,
Again, that's gonna contribute to just sheer pounds of fat and pounds of protein going out the door, just because those older cows are producing more.
circle back, Cora, maybe on some, you alluded to a little bit of it, but it's certainly something I've run into quite a bit over time is we can focus on what's on paper for the diet and things like that, but how it's either implemented at the farm level and or other management factors can just make such a big difference in outcomes. I mean, I think about you talked a little bit before about overcrowding, and we know from lots of work at Minor and British Columbia and other places that in Guelph with Trevor DeVries that cows that are overstocked, they slug feed. That certainly has an impact on the rumen environment. I think about dairies that say we're gonna feed to a zero slick bunk, right, zero refusal, and they combine. I'm thinking I've got one dairy in my head from a few years ago that they were never seen to make components, right. And it frustrated them, but they were 30% overcrowded in a 6-row barn configuration. They were feeding to a slick bunk, or trying to feed to a slick bunk. Now again, and I think it's questionable how well dairies can really do that. And so you just end up in situations where we have on-farm factors that are affecting how those cows are consuming feed and probably impacting that rumen environment. And again, it sounds like you certainly make progress on that. Cameras seem like a great idea in a lot of cases as you're trying to manage some of that. And of course, obviously, our feeding management software systems can really help us there too.
No, and I think we probably, in a lot of cases, I know some of the work that Trevor DeVries has done on a lot of herds, we're probably just not pushing up feed nearly as many times a day as what we should. I think the common thought process, if we push it up 6 times a day, that probably will cover us. It's, if you really want to have healthy cows that are going to be efficient, and especially in these overcrowding situations, you're probably looking, in my opinion, with the research work that's been done out there and just what I see on client farms I work with, that if we're not at close to 12 times a day, we're probably not getting the job done the way we ought to be.
Corwin, how are those cameras being monitored?
Well, the camera system, they basically a continuous recording. You can pretty easily, with the systems I'm seeing now, you can go back, 2 days, 3 days, you can go back 10 hours, you can go back 12 hours, okay. And just a matter of taking the time to do it. So, trying to get managers to do it to their benefit is certainly part of the discussion. And then when I'm on the farm, I'll certainly spend a little bit of time just taking a look at the last last couple of days to just see what the activity has been like.
Mm-hmm.
There is a system out there now. It's been brought to the attention of a couple of my clients. Neither one have moved on it at this point in time, but I know there's some systems out in California and in other parts of the country where it's basically a minute by minute, 24-hour a day feed monitoring camera system. And I think that kind of technology is probably going to be more common as we go forward here. Just a matter of producers trying to justify the cost of those kind of systems. But I think as we see more of those types of things come along, more of that technology will come into place, I'm sure.
Corwin, one of the things you and I've talked about is, of course, every year seems to bring a new wrinkle. The last year brought a really big wrinkle, but, with COVID and changes in milk dynamics of milk supply and things like that, of course, most of the milk in the Northeast is now under some sort of base program. And, curious on your perspectives in terms of how that's affected how you think about components anyway and managing for components at the herd level.
In the last 2 weeks, I've had conversations with 2 different clients, both shipping to the same co-op, asking me, how do we reduce milk production by a couple of pounds per cow per day? I can honestly say in the many years I have done this, I've never been asked a question like that. It's always, how do we get 2 more pounds out of these cows, not how do we reduce production? Because the penalty they're getting for that over-base milk is pretty severe. So, our approach is definitely, again, this focus on components. Every pound of milk that goes out there, how can we have the best value to it relative to percent of fat and percent of protein in it? I am not in the position at this point in time to make drastic changes in diets that I'm going to say is going to reduce milk by 1 or 2 pounds per cow. That's not an easy thing to do from a biology standpoint. But we're trying to, the changes I'm making in those herds though is very slow increments, a little more forage, little less starch, maybe a little less MP. I'm not shorting them on the MP at this point in time. Probably doing it more over on the starch side of the equation, running a little more forage in those diets, and we're just going to do it slowly and incrementally, and see what the cows tell us. So that's kind of been the approach at this point in time, and we get the double whammy of high commodity prices on the corn and protein side of things too. So helping to cheapen those diets up just a touch at the same time. But no, very, very different dynamic that we've been in for the last 16 or so months of these base programs. And not that we weren't focusing on components before, but definitely putting more of a focus due to the base program issues that we're dealing with now.
Wouldn't it be more efficient just to kind of reduce the cow population a little bit and maximize their output?
Yeah, and that's a good question, Scott. And so I've got the smallest herd I work with, 250 cows. We were 99.2 pounds of milk shipped last month, and the co-op they shipped to is a severe penalty on their over-base milk. They sold a few cows. They did sell a few cows. Another co-op with a different base program, we're still on the over-base penalty. We're still able to cover our variable cost. So the producers look at, do I really want to cut cow numbers to anything severe, because the penalty just isn't that great relative to what my my variable costs are on a day in and day out basis. When this all came about in March of 2020, yes, we did go through, and there were definitely some culling activities took place early on. And there were probably cows that should have been shipped even before the base program, came about. But as we have seen in the past with milk diversion programs and other programs, we sold 45 cows within 15 days and the milk tank didn't change.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of told you what overcrowding was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, these, and the other problem is the real dilemma in all this for the producers, in my opinion, and I think they would say the same thing because they've said this to me, is they don't know month to month or what 2022 is going to bring. So if I sell 200 cows and then all of a sudden the program goes away, well, I've just shot myself in the foot because there is no idea of what next month or what the next 6 months or what the 12 months is going to bring relative to these base programs.
Yeah, it's going to be my next question. Is this the new normal? Do we have a clue, or at least any theories, Tom, on or Corwin, on what we can expect in the future with these base programs?
I don't have a clue, Scott. I don't,
Yeah.
and I don't think my producers could tell you they have a clue either.
Yeah, Scott, I don't have any inside knowledge, but I think that there's been I think once now that they're in, right? I think they're in. I think the co-ops are going to vary them based on they can move the dial up and down, right? But I think the fact that they're in, I don't think they're going anywhere. But that's just conjecture and opinion.
No, I would tend to agree with that sentiment, Tom. I think the one thing that it definitely at this point in time is we are not going to see any expansions of any sort here in the Northeast.
Clay, I think we need to find maybe a milk processor to bring onto the exchange some night and talk about this.
Yeah,
I would totally and wholeheartedly support that, because that's where we are missing the boat here. Is we need milk processing capability to handle what we can do here in the Northeast. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're seeing, I sit in my Morrison Hall office, and if I'm in that office, I can look over at food science, and Dave Barbano's there, and Dave's been making a lot of drawing attention to and really developing, I would say, enhanced milk composition testing. Right? I mean, we've gotten things like fat and protein and milk urea nitrogen and total solids and milk urea, and lactose for somatic cell for eons. But now we're getting more detailed testing anyway, and so we're actually talking about the fatty acids fractions. So things like de novo fatty acids, those are the fatty acids made in the mammary gland from basically from the rumen, from things acid production of the rumen, like Corwin talked about. Preformed, which come from the diet largely, a little bit from body fat potentially in a fresh cow, and mixed, which are really in two different places. And so, that's becoming more and more prevalent out there. And at this point, a pretty good chunk of the herds in the Northeast are now receiving that information. So, one of the things, Corwin and I wrestled with this a little bit. I think, his herds are starting to get it, but Minor Institute's done some nice work and collaborated with Dave and has shown their relationships of things like de novo fatty acids and others with not only the overall milk fat, but milk protein. And people are increasingly looking at de novos maybe as an indicator of rumen efficiency, maybe rumen health, but certainly just how well are we doing on those rumens.
Tom, if you don't mind, before we kind of dive into that, Dr. Zimmerman the other day gave me a very nice, succinct tutorial talking about the difference between de novo and consumed fatty acids and how they're built. That really solidified it in my mind. It helped me understand it a bit. I was just wondering if he might kind of share that with us real quick.
Yeah, go for it, Clay, because I'd like a succinct. I don't think I did.
I'm lucky to learn something, Clay.
Yeah.
So, Scott, to answer your question, these de novo fatty acids are, they're actually built in the mammary gland. using either acetate or beta hydroxybutyrate as their as the skeleton to start with, and then we add two carbons at a time. So basically anything from 4 carbons up to 16 carbons can be formed in the mammary gland. They're your de novo fatty acids. So as Tom alluded to earlier when he was talking about Kevin Harvatine's research, if we can increase acetate production, good rumen function, will increase de novo fatty acids in the milk. The preformed fatty acids then are your 16 and 18 carbon fatty acids. So they come either directly from the diet, or as Tom said earlier, they're from adipose tissue mobilization in these fresh cows. So your C18s, we know, those are preformed fatty acids. Everything up to 16 carbon fatty acids we know are de novo, and your C16s come from both sources. So we refer to those as the mixed fatty acid pool, then, your C16s.
Yeah.
So Tom, what should we do with this information? There's new information now coming out to these dairy producers and nutritionists. How do we utilize this information?
Yeah, I think to me anyway, granted, these fractions are all going to correlate with total milk fat product or total milk fat percentage, right? They're all going to kind of move up and down together. That said, if we're in a situation of the more milk fat depression type scenario, they all go down, but the de novos go down actually proportionally more. And so, it kind of helps us identify where that issue may be, or at least, and there's some other indices that they get relative to unsaturated fatty acids that may actually help us troubleshoot that a little bit further, just dial that in even a bit further. I'm curious as more herds have that information, right? We're getting into summertime now, or we're in summertime now. It was 90 degrees here last week and humid. Our herds that are in more heat stress scenarios are we going to use those as kind of a gauge in terms of how much of an impact we might be having on those rumens in those heat stress environments? Again, I don't know that for sure, but I think it's worthy to kind of think about that and maybe use that at the herd level to be able to compare herds with each other relative to, okay, one herd changes a lot in some of these metrics, and other herds may not change as much if we're not seeing the same swings in environment or feeding management or things like that.
But there is a seasonal variation in de novos that follows the regular seasonal fat and protein percent curves, correct?
Yeah, if you look at Kevin's work, right? I mean, look at the seasonal variation. A lot of that is tied to de novo and probably the mixed pool, less so with the preformed, and that's kind of interesting. So, it does look like there may be some. And again, why that is, that's a good question. Because you don't know I don't know as I think about rumen function changing in the spring, early spring anyway. Obviously, you can make the case in a heat stress scenario that you might see some changes there, but it's something where, it's like everything else, is you have the information and we all wrestle with it. Going forward, we learn more about exactly how we use it and in fact, how useful, how useful it is and what it helps us do at the herd level.
It's interesting you say that, Clay, because I was just looking at one of my herds this morning that Tom was actually out on with me this past winter, and that herd during the winter and up until probably a month ago, our de novos 0.92 to 0.98, just day in and day out. And I looked at them this morning, and I'm down to the low to mid 0.8s. I'll be walking those cows tomorrow. I'm really curious. And have I made any major diet changes or anything? No. So I'm curious to go walk the cows tomorrow and see if I see anything. Yes, those de novos have come down. Fat has gone from 4.1, 4.12 to 4.0, in that same time frame there. But boy, I was really shocked how much the de novo levels had dropped. And this is actually, in my opinion, probably one of my better heat stress managed herds, sprinklers, lots of fans and all. So I'm still scratching my head a lot about what some of those numbers are really telling me day in and day out, and what do I do with them from a dietary change standpoint. I'm not there yet.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. Another tool in the toolbox potentially, but we need to learn more. I think we need to learn more about what to do with the data. So, Tom, you can help us out there.
So, Heather Dan's done some nice work there, right? So Miner's done some nice work where they, where if you get the combination of the low butterfat test plus the low de novo, that's clearly kind of a milk fat depression type scenario, and kind of know how to get on in that direction. If it's high butterfat test and high de novo, things, Heather would say, keep up the good work, right? But when you have, say, low de novo yet fat test is decent, well, are you buying some of that butter fat with some of the dry fats and things like that? And is there an opportunity to do better in the rumen? Likewise, if butter fat is just kind of okay, but de novos are high, maybe there's an opportunity for some of the high palm fat sources and things like that. So I think there's, that's really her. I'm just presenting what she's really conceived there, but it's kind of resonated with me, and I think it's a good starting point. But again, we just as we get this information on more and more herds, we'll be able to understand how and where to use it, I think, even better.
I don't know how much Tom is aware, but to make you aware, Clay, I know Jess McCart up at the vet school here at Cornell is she's looking at that, working with Dave Barbano on looking at that type of information from a herd health standpoint too. So it'll be interesting to see what Jess and her group, if anything comes out of the herd health side of it relative to some of this data.
Gentlemen, time has flown by, and they just called last call. Are there any key items that you guys would like to discuss before we close this out?
No, I just appreciate the invitation, Scott and Clay. This is a good conversation this evening. It's been an eye opener for me over the last few years that how much components when you talk to the bankers that we work with. Look at the milk checks that our clients deal with. You're looking at fat and protein making up, depending on the year and the time of the year, anywhere from 85 to I think upwards of 92, 93% of their milk check. So this is huge, from a financial standpoint, and something that we've got to just continue to pay attention to within the industry to make the financial side of the equation more positive for these guys.
Any final thoughts for nutritionists and dairymen out there? A couple takeaways you'd like to leave with them?
Good fiber digestibility. To me, that's the key to any nutrition program. And feeding management. We deal with a lot of overcrowded barns here. That's not going to change. But can we get our feeders and feeding management into a routine that we are not slug feeding, that any cow at any time that wants to go up and eat has got the ability to do that? I think those are two key things that we continue to press with our clients day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. Tom, a couple things from you, key takeaways for the audience, and then I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the upcoming Cornell Nutrition Conference, when that is, and why someone might want to come to that, which is one of the premier nutrition conferences in the country, by the way.
Yeah. So again, just I think understanding the components, really keying on component yields and feed efficiency, as Corwin talked about, component efficiency. That's really, really important at the herd level, and lots of things affect that. I think herds need to recognize that, as we talked about with seasonality, you're fighting biology certain parts of the year, and sometimes holding steady is actually a win, right, during some of these parts of the year, and so and I think those are some key things. I think relative to Cornell Nutrition Conference, we are excited to be in person this year. So we will be October 19th to the 21st. I think of the dates in Syracuse. It's the usual Tuesday through Thursday format that we traditionally have done. Of course, New York is opening up quickly on lots of things relative to COVID restrictions and things like that. And I expect things will be even more open by then. We are planning to do a virtual kind of live stream of the conference as well for those in other parts of the world or otherwise wouldn't either might not be able to attend or would like to attend but just wouldn't attend in person. But I don't think that's going to take too much away from our in-person audience. I think we're ready to be not in front of computer screens all the time and have the chance to interact with each other as the networking is such an important part of those conferences and events. And we're really looking forward to getting back to that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank both of you for joining us here at the Exchange tonight. This has been a lot of fun. I could stay here all night and talk with you gentlemen. Impacting dairy farmer profitability is so important. It's always changing, and bringing this kind of information is very important. So we appreciate you for that, and we'd like to bring you back sometime if you guys are open to it. The pub is always open. So I'd also like to thank our loyal listeners for stopping by to the Exchange once again to spend some time with us. And if you like what you heard, please remember to drop us a 5-star rating on your way out. Don't forget to request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt. I think, gentlemen, you guys should both have one of those on the way if you haven't received it already. Don't forget to subscribe to the Real Science Exchange on your favorite podcast platform. Our Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month. Visit balchemanh.com/realscience to see upcoming events and past topics. We hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.